Tonight, you're not simply falling asleep. You're stepping into the first gallery of a great exhibition of the human soul. Close your eyes and allow yourself to drift into a sleep where lines, shapes, and symbols speak in the language of humanity's oldest memory. Chapter 2. Art for Eternity. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Crete. Art in one form or another can be found all around the world. But if we think of art history as a continuous process, with one moment flowing into the next like a river, then its true beginnings are not in the painted caves of southern France, nor in the ancient villages of North America. Those early artistic expressions are mysterious and beautiful in their own right. But they do not form a direct lineage to the art we know today. Instead, the tradition that links our modern world, from buildings to posters to the distant past, begins some 5,000 years ago, in the Nile Valley. It's here that a thread begins, passed from master to apprentice, from apprentice to admirer or copyist, continuing all the way to the present. Later, we'll see how the Greeks learned from the Egyptians, and how we, in turn, learned from the Greeks. This is one reason why the art of ancient Egypt holds such importance for us. Everyone knows that Egypt is the land of pyramids. These ancient, weathered mountains of stone rise like silent markers on the far horizon of history. They may look foreign, even impenetrable, but they have a lot to tell us, if we know how to listen. The pyramids tell the story of a society so well organized that it could build these immense monuments during the lifetime of a single ruler. They speak of wealth, of central power, and of thousands of laborers working year after year, cutting granite blocks in quarries, hauling them to the construction site, lifting them into place with primitive tools, all for the purpose of creating a tomb that would house the body of a king. No other people, no other king, ever dared to commit such effort, such resources, to a single monument to the dead. But for the pharaohs and their people, the pyramids weren't just symbolic. They had a practical role to play. You see, the pharaoh was believed to be a divine being, a bridge between the world of gods and the world of humans. When his time on earth ended, he was expected to return to the heavens to join the gods he came from. And so it was thought, the soaring shape of the pyramid might help guide his soul upward, or at the very least, protect his sacred remains. Because for the ancient Egyptians, preserving the body was essential. They believed the soul needed it in order to continue its journey in the afterlife. So they developed a sophisticated method of mummification, carefully wrapping the body in linen bandages after treating it with preserving oils and resins. It was this mummified body, this sacred form, that the pyramid was built to shelter. The pharaoh's remains would be placed in a stone sarcophagus, deep in the center of the massive structure. Around him, on the walls of the burial chamber, they carved magical spells and sacred texts, words meant to guide him through the challenges of the afterlife, like a kind of spiritual map. But architecture alone was not enough. The Egyptians believed that even if the body were destroyed, a durable likeness, a strong, permanent image of the king, could ensure the soul's survival. So, at the pharaoh's command, sculptors carved his features from hard granite, placing these hidden likenesses inside the tomb. Invisible to the world, these sculptures stood in for the king, holding space for his soul, keeping it tethered to form. And fittingly, one of the ancient Egyptian words for sculptor translates quite literally as He who keeps alive. In the beginning, this funerary tradition was meant only for the pharaoh. But as time passed, the highest officials and courtiers began building smaller tombs for themselves, carefully arranged in neat rows around the king's grand burial site. Little by little, it became expected, even necessary, for any self-respecting individual to prepare for their life after death well in advance. Inside these costly tombs rested the mummified bodies and stone likenesses of the deceased. These were homes for the soul, places where it could dwell and receive offerings of food and drink. Among these early portraits, dating back to the Pyramid Age and the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, we find some true masterpieces of Egyptian art. Their dignified simplicity and quiet grandeur leave a lasting impression. There is no flattery in these sculptures, no attempt to capture fleeting facial expressions. The sculptor cared only for what was essential. Every secondary detail was stripped away. And this restrained focus, this unwavering attention to the fundamental structure of the human face, gives the statues their deep, meditative power. Even with their almost geometric severity, these faces are nothing like the tribal masks we looked at in the first chapter. And they are certainly far removed from the vivid, naturalistic portraits created by Nigerian artists. Here, two forces are perfectly balanced: close observation of nature and a strict sense of form. The result: faces that appear to exist outside of time, withdrawn from the noise of life, suspended in a kind of eternal stillness. This blend of geometric order and keen observation is, in many ways, the signature of Egyptian art. You can see it most clearly in the reliefs and wall paintings that decorate tombs, although to call it decoration feels inadequate. These works were meant for the eyes of the dead. Hidden from the living, these images had one sacred task: to preserve life. Once upon a time, in a far more brutal age, powerful men would take their servants and slaves with them into the grave. These people were sacrificed so that the Lord could enter the afterlife properly accompanied. But over time, such horrifying customs came to be seen as, well, either too cruel or simply too expensive. That's when art stepped in. Instead of living attendants, the tombs were now filled with images, painted scenes and sculpted figures meant to follow the soul into the next world. This wasn't just an Egyptian idea. It's something we find in many ancient cultures. But the Egyptians brought it to a refined and hauntingly beautiful level. These paintings and reliefs give us a vivid glimpse into the daily life of ancient Egypt: farming, fishing, dancing, offering rituals. But when you first see them, they might feel strange, puzzling even. That's because Egyptian artists had a different goal from ours. They weren't interested in beauty for beauty's sake. Their aim was clarity, completeness. They didn't sketch things from random viewpoints. They drew from memory, and they followed strict rules. Every part of the figure had to be shown in its most recognizable form: the head in profile, the eyes seen frontally, the shoulders facing forward, the feet in profile again. It's a method that's almost closer to map-making than painting. A good example is how they drew a garden. Imagine a rectangle filled with symmetrical rows of trees, neatly lined walkways, and a central pool shaped like a perfect blue rectangle, as if seen from above. If we were to draw the same scene, we'd probably stand at an angle, try to sketch it from life, maybe capture the play of light. But that wasn't their concern. They wanted the garden to be understood, not merely seen. And this, perhaps, is the real heart of Egyptian art. The deep belief that to see something truly is to know it eternally. If we were to draw a similar scene ourselves, we'd probably start by looking for the right angle, the most natural, the most convenient. Trees, for instance, are best seen frontally. But a pond? That only makes sense when viewed from above. The ancient Egyptians didn't worry about such things. They simply showed the pond from above, and the trees head on. Birds and fish in the pond? Hard to recognize from a top-down view. So they drew them in profile. This simple example reveals the core of the Egyptian method. It's actually something children often do quite instinctively, drawing what they know, not what they see. The only difference is that the Egyptians applied this approach with far more precision and consistency. Each element had to be shown from its most recognizable, characteristic viewpoint. Take a look at illustration 34, and you'll see what this meant for depicting the human figure. The shape of the head is clearest in profile, and so that's how it's drawn. But the eye? We always imagine the eye from a frontal view. So, naturally, the profile of the face is paired with a full-on eye. The upper body, the shoulders, the chest, is best understood for the front, because only then can you see how the arms connect to the torso. But hands and feet, those are better outlined from the side. And this is exactly why human figures in Egyptian art often look oddly flat or even twisted. Like the body isn't quite sure what direction it's facing. To make matters even trickier, it was hard for artists to show both feet from a single, consistent angle. So they chose clarity over realism. Both feet are drawn from the inside view, as if the person had, amusingly, two left feet. Of course, this doesn't mean the Egyptians believed people actually looked like that. They weren't naive. They simply followed a method, one that allowed them to capture everything they considered important about the human form. And it's likely that the strict formal rules they followed had a magical dimension as well. After all, how could someone with a shortened or missing arm offer or receive gifts in the afterlife? In Egyptian art, as in so much of their culture, the focus wasn't on what could be seen in the moment, but on what could be understood in the mind. The image was constructed from known elements, pieces of reality the artist had studied and internalized. Just as an artisan from a tribal society might build a figure from the shapes embedded in their craft traditions. But the Egyptian artist didn't just depict what was visible. They showed what mattered, the meaning behind the form. It's like when we call someone the big boss. The Egyptians made their bosses literally bigger. In their paintings, the master is often twice the size of his servants or his wives. And once we begin to understand the logic behind these visual conventions, we can start to read the Egyptian pictorial language. A language they used to describe their world and their lives. Take illustration 35, for example. It shows a beautifully composed wall painting from the tomb of a high official during the Middle Kingdom, painted around 1900 BCE. The hieroglyphic inscriptions tell us who he was, his full name and every title he ever held. It's almost like reading his ancient CV. His name was Khnumhotep. He was the chief of the Eastern Desert, the nomarch of Menet Khufu, a trusted friend of the pharaoh, a royal confidant, the high steward of all the priests. priest of Horus, priest of Anubis, chief keeper of the divine secrets, and, perhaps the most glorious title of all, master of all tunics. On the left, we see him, armed with something resembling a boomerang, hunting game accompanied by his wife Heti, his concubine Jet, and his son who, though depicted as very small, bore the title of Chief Administrator of the Borderlands. On the lower frieze, fishermen are shown hauling in their catch under the supervision of a foreman in the service of Mentuhotep. Above the doorframe, Khnum-hotep appears once again, this time catching birds with a net. Understanding the methods of Egyptian artists, it is not difficult to see how the trap worked. The hunter sits crouched behind a wall of reeds, holding a rope attached to the open net, shown from above. When the birds land on the bait, he pulls the rope and the net closes. Behind Khnum-hotep stands his eldest son Nakht and his personal overseer of the treasury, who also supervised the construction and decoration of the tomb. On the right side of the painting, Khnum-hotep is celebrated as great in fish catching, rich in game, devotee of the goddess of the hunt, and is shown spearing fish, seal. Mupatta'ar. Again, the Egyptian painter uses a conventional device to make the water appear to rise out of the reeds, revealing a pool teeming with fish. An inscription reads, "Sailing in a boat through the papyrus thickets, across ponds full of game, through still waters and swift currents, he spears 30 fish at once with a double-headed spear." How splendid is the day of hippopotamus hunting. Below, a humorous episode is depicted. A man has fallen into the water and his companions are hauling him out. The inscriptions around the door specify the days on which offerings should be made to the deceased and include prayers to the gods. As we become accustomed to the visual language of Egyptian painting, we begin to treat its conventions with the same indifference we grant to the absence of color in photography. We even come to appreciate the advantages of the Egyptian system. Nothing here is accidental. Nothing may be displaced or rearranged. Try, for example, to take a pencil and copy one of these primitive drawings. Most likely your version will come out lopsided, hunched, and awkward. Mine certainly did. Egyptian art possesses such internal harmony and coherence that the slightest deviation breaks the entire order. Before beginning, the Egyptian artist would draw a grid of straight lines across the wall and then carefully transfer the figures onto this framework. Yet this geometric rigor did not hinder his ability to capture nature with remarkable accuracy. The appearance of each fish and bird is rendered with such fidelity that modern zoologists can easily identify their species. Illustration 37 shows a detail from illustration 35. A tree filled with birds caught in Khnum-hotep's net. The movement of the artist's hand was guided not only by technical skill, but by a perceptive eye attuned to the outlines of the natural world. One of the greatest achievements of Egyptian art lies in its capacity to place every sculptural, pictorial, or architectural form precisely where it belongs, as though obeying an invisible law. This law, which governs all artistic creation within a given culture, is what we call style. It is difficult to define style in words, far easier to recognize it with the eye. The consistent norms that permeate all of Egyptian art lend each individual work a serene clarity and strict formal discipline. The style of ancient Egypt emerged from a codified system of laws that every artist learned from an early age. In sculpture, all seated figures rest their hands on their knees. The male body is painted darker than the female. The appearance of each deity was predetermined. Thus Horus, the sky god, was shown as a falcon or with a falcon's head. Anubis, the god of funerary rites, as a jackal or with a jackal's head. See ill. 38. Every artist was required to master the art of fine writing and to carve not only images but also hieroglyphs with clarity and precision. But once all these requirements were fulfilled, his training was considered complete. He was not expected to show any originality. On the contrary, the best artist was likely the one who could reproduce a statue that most closely resembled the revered monuments of the past. As a result, Egyptian art changed very little over more than 3 millennia. What was considered worthy and beautiful in the age of the pyramids was judged by the same standards 1,000 years later. Of course, daily life evolved and new themes emerged. But the basic method of depicting humans and nature remained largely unaltered. Only one figure in Egyptian history succeeded in shaking the solid foundations of this stylistic order. A pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, which arose after a period of devastating foreign invasion. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV was a heretic. He broke with the customs sanctified by centuries of tradition. Rejecting the pantheon of his people's many gods, he introduced the cult of a single supreme deity, the Aten, depicted as a solar disk whose rays end in hands. He renamed himself Akhenaten after his god, and moved his court far from the priests of the old cults, to a place now known as Tel el Amarna. It is reasonable to assume that the imagery created under his patronage must have shocked contemporary Egyptians with its novelty. Gone was the solemn dignity typical of royal portraits. Instead, we see Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti playing tenderly with their children under the blessing rays of the sun. See Ill 40. In some portraits, Akhenaten is portrayed as grotesquely deformed. See illustration 39, perhaps at his own insistence, to reveal his human frailty. It is equally possible that, convinced of his prophetic uniqueness, he demanded strict likenesses. His successor was Tutankhamun, whose tomb, discovered in 1922, contained treasures that continued the artistic line developed under the Aten religion. On the back of his throne, see illustration 42. The royal couple is depicted in a scene of domestic intimacy. The pharaoh's relaxed pose might well have scandalized a conservative Egyptian viewer. The queen, whose figure is as large as the king's, gently touches her husband's shoulder, while the solar deity extends blessing hands toward them. It is possible that this artistic reform during the 18th dynasty was enabled by exposure to foreign art forms that were less rigid in their conventions than those of Egypt. On the distant island of Crete, there once lived a gifted people whose artists captured movement with extraordinary finesse. When archaeologists excavated the royal palace at Knossos in the late 19th century, it was difficult to believe that such a free and refined style had emerged as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. This artistic style was also discovered on the Greek mainland. In the lion hunt scene depicted on a dagger from Mycenae, flowing, flexible lines create a vivid sense of movement. Such works may have even influenced Egyptian artists, who were occasionally permitted to deviate from their own sacred canons. But this period of openness in Egyptian art was short-lived. By the time of Tutankhamun, earlier religious beliefs had been restored, and the window to the outside world was once again firmly shut. The Egyptian artistic style, already more than 1,000 years old at that point, would remain unchanged for yet another millennium. Egyptians never questioned its correctness. Most of the Egyptian artworks in our museums, along with nearly all surviving temples and palaces, come from this later period. New themes and challenges emerged over time, but the core principles of the art remained steadfast. During these millennia, of course, Egypt was not the only powerful state in the ancient Near East. From the Bible, we know that small Palestine lay between Egypt, centered around the Nile, and the kingdoms of Babylon and Assyria that arose in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The art of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, as the Greeks called it, is less well known than Egyptian art, and for several reasons. There was no local source of stone, so most buildings were made of sun-dried brick, which crumbled into dust over time. Stone sculpture was relatively rare. But more than that, the peoples of Mesopotamia did not possess a religion like that of the Egyptians, which drove them to preserve the body after death and create human likenesses to house the soul. In the early days of the Sumerian kingdom, centered in the city of rulers were buried with their households, attendants, and precious belongings to ensure they entered the next world fully equipped. Excavations at uncovered many royal objects, now on view at the British Museum. Strangely, artistic sophistication and exquisite craftsmanship coexisted with primitive superstitions and cruelty. One tomb contained a harp decorated with figures of mythical animals. These figures, strikingly reminiscent of heraldic symbols, not only in form but in their structured arrangement, show that the Sumerians appreciated beauty, symmetry, and finely crafted lines. The exact meaning of these creatures is unknown, but their mythological significance is clear. Despite their fairy tale appearance, they carried a serious symbolic weight. Though Mesopotamian artists did not decorate tombs, they sought in other ways to grant immortality to rulers. From early on, the peoples of Mesopotamia built monuments celebrating kings' victories, depicting vanquished enemies and captured spoils. One relief shows a king trampling a defeated opponent, while the survivors beg for mercy. It seems likely that such monuments were not only meant to commemorate past campaigns. In those times, people still believed in the real, magical power of images. The belief that what is depicted could shape reality. As long as a king was shown stepping on his enemy's throat, it was hoped the conquered people would not dare rise again. Later, these monuments began to feature entire visual narratives of military campaigns. Some of the best preserved examples come from the reign of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, who lived in the 9th century BCE, slightly after the biblical King Solomon. These reliefs document the events of a well-planned military expedition. One fragment shows a fortress under siege, battering rams in action, defenders falling from the walls, a woman atop a tower crying out in despair. The style is reminiscent of Egyptian art, though perhaps a little less constrained by rigid rules. These scenes are almost like an ancient newsreel, so convincingly do they convey the unfolding of real events. But on closer inspection, something interesting emerges. Among the dead and wounded, not a single Assyrian is to be found. Even in those early days, propaganda and self-glorification had taken root. But let us be gentle with the Assyrians. Perhaps they too were influenced by the ancient belief we've already encountered, that an image is more than just an image. For this reason, they may have avoided depicting their own people in pain or defeat. In any case, the tradition they established would live on for centuries. Even today, if you look at any monument that celebrates military valor, you will notice one striking absence: the war itself. You merely arrived, and the enemy scattered like chaff in the wind. You can close your eyes now. Picture the lion hunts of Mycenae, the golden tombs of Ur, the stone colonnades of Luxor. Picture the sculptor's hand, shaping kings from dust and memory. Time has passed. Empires have fallen, but their shadows still dance on the walls of ancient palaces. Sleep well, among gods, lions, and lost languages. Your sleep will be soft, and you, protected by ancient symbols, where everything is connected to everything.